So, as I'm sure many of you probably already know, playing a TTRPG like D&D or Pathfinder can be super fun. But the sad truth of the matter is, there is a lot of rules that go completely unspoken of that surround the etiquette and how to behave during your game sessions that many GMs and players don't even talk about and doesn't even get written about in most core rulebooks. But fear not, because my name is Nate Munn, and in this video I'm going to be covering my top 10 unspoken TTRPG rules that every player should know. But before we begin, I have been noticing that recently a lot of people have been trying out Pathfinder 2nd Edition for one reason or another.
You don't say. You don't say. You don't say!
And it's because of this that a lot of people have either been running or playing in the beginner box adventure Menace Under Otari for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But as a professional GM who has ran that adventure dozens of times at this point, I have found some ways to improve that campaign. So if you want to hear about my big tips and tricks in regards to improving that campaign, if this video gets 30 likes, I will release my video talking about my big changes to the Menace Under Otari adventure. But without further ado, let's dive right into the video, starting off with number 10. Don't be a rules lawyer. So being a rules lawyer is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when you become so obsessed with the rules and following every single rule to the letter that it replaces the game itself. Because if you're so focused with following every single rule as written and arguing with the DM every single time they make a ruling on something that you happen to disagree with, or maybe goes against some of the rules in the core rulebook, then that is when it becomes an issue, and where it can become kind of annoying to the other players. So be sure that if you are doing this, or following the rules a little bit too closely and realizing that the GM may be foregoing a couple of rules, or bending a couple of the rules, just be sure to obviously raise your hand and ask for clarification, because generally the GM is very understanding and will be happy to explain their reasoning in regards to bending a certain rule or just being a little lenient when it comes to the description of a particular feature. But moving on now to number 9. Don't be disruptive. So maybe you just heard me say this rule and you're like, okay, well obviously I don't want to be disruptive, I mean duh. But the biggest issue here is not necessarily being disruptive, but more so that is your play style is being disruptive. So if you're a player who's perhaps constantly getting up from the table and causing issues and ruining the immersion for other players, that is an issue. But one of the biggest issues that I've found in my experience with being a GM is when a player is disruptive both in the game and out of the game and uses the excuse, oh, it's what my character would do. So for example, are the other players trying to weasel their way out of getting arrested by the town guards and you attempt to steal one of the guards' coin pouches because you think it'd be funny? Or perhaps the party is conversing with the Master of the Mistwood to barter for safe passage, and you decide to punch him in the face because you think he was being a little rude and you don't like that. Well, if that's the case, maybe don't do that, or at least wait till a better moment where it's not a critical role-playing moment. Because while yes, it may be what your character would have done in the moment, and while you can argue that until the cows come home, the biggest issue with this type of player is that they don't realize the implications, or more so the consequences I should say, for your party members, as well as the campaign as a whole. Because if you attack every crucial NPC that you come across because they aren't doing what you like, and then that completely derails the campaign, that could lead to potentially sessions of time being wasted for you have to get back onto track, or more so have to completely subvert a portion of the campaign. So if you feel like you're being a disruptive player, just consider before you punch the wizard in the face because he was being a little rude to you, think of the consequences for your actions and realize that while yes, it would be funny in the moment, and maybe yes, it would be what your character would have done, it could completely ruin the campaign because this is a crucial moment in the campaign that the GM has planned for. So for example, in Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship is going into Lothlorien, I believe, the woods with all the elves, right? And then Gimli is walking through the forest with the rest of the party and he tells the other hobbits to stay close to him or whatever, and he's talking about the elves, and then the elves surround the party and then pull an arrow directly to Gimli's face. Well, if he were to in that moment say, out of game, if this was like a TTRPG we were playing, oh well, it's what my character would do, so I grab the bow and I punch the elf in the face. While yes, maybe you could argue that's what his character would have done, realize that while that is what your character would do, it would ruin the campaign because they would get kicked out of the woods, or the woods would become hostile territory, and your fellowship or your party could potentially die because of your actions because you thought it'd be funny in the moment. So while yes, you may think that you are being right in role-playing your character that way, just realize that there are consequences for it. But now we're moving on to number 8. Don't metagame. So metagaming is essentially using information that your character wouldn't know to your character's advantage. So for example, if you happen to know as a player that red dragons are immune to fire damage because, I mean, obviously, right? But if your character doesn't know that, then it's important to realize that distinction and that difference, I should say. Or perhaps maybe if you're in a VTT and maybe your GM accidentally reveals a portion of the room he wasn't supposed to, or perhaps maybe you happen to catch a glimpse of a particular token on the other side of a wall and you realize, oh my gosh, there is a giant in that next room, or something like that, or to that effect, then it's important that you realize that there is a difference for what your character would know and what your player would know. And this, in my humble opinion, is one of the hardest tricks to get down, is realizing that there is a distinction and how to play your character from your character's perspective rather than your player's perspective. Because while you, the player, may know that there is a giant in the next room for some reason, or perhaps maybe you as the player know that red dragons are immune to fire damage, it's important to realize that there is a difference between what your character would know and what you would know. And if you ever get confused what your character would know, just raise your hand and ask the GM, hey, would I hear anything in the next room? Because I happen to know that there is a giant in there now as a player, but would I hear anything? Or perhaps if you're fighting a dragon for some reason, you can ask your GM, hey, would my character have heard any legends regarding the red-scaled fiery dragons of the north or whatever, and I would know that they're immune to fire damage? And then you can either roll to determine if you know that information, or your GM can just straight up tell you, no, you wouldn't know anything about red dragons, and so forth. So that can kind of clear that up. But now we're moving on to number 7. Don't be a murder hobo. So, a murder hobo, for those of you who don't know what it is essentially a player or a playstyle who deals with every situation by killing, murdering, torturing, or so forth, because that's the easiest solution to every situation, right? No, wrong. Most definitely wrong. And the reason why I include this on my list is because a lot of players, when they're first joining into D&D, think it's a game like Skyrim, right? Where if you want to do something crazy, you can just quick save, do your crazy activity, and then reload into your last save point, and then everything's good to go, and nothing ever happened, right? Well, wrong. The majority of the time, most TTRPGs are kind of based in reality, and the GM deals with encounters and situations realistically how that monster or NPC would deal with that situation. So if your solution to every encounter is just to kill something, or if the barkeep or more so the magic store owner isn't giving you a discount on that magic item you want, so you decide to kill him and take everything in the store for yourself, well, guess what? There are probably bounty hunters or guards in that city or town that you're currently in, and they will come and get you and throw you in jail, and then the entire campaign turns into a jailbreak campaign rather than hunt down the evil mafia boss who is stealing children off the streets campaign. Like, you know what I mean? And in general, murder hobos are not fun to play with on the GM side of things. While it can be fun for the players for a little bit, being a GM and running a campaign of just nothing but murder hobos can be very annoying when you're having to plan for every situation being dealt with by either murder, killing, torture, or etc. So if you are finding yourself being this type of player, just like I said before with the disruptive type of player, make sure that you are reading the room and realizing that not every situation can be dealt with by just killing the NPC or murdering something in one way or another. But now we're moving on to number 6. Don't split the party, or at least not for large amounts of time. So this pretty much goes without saying, but generally with most TTRPGs, they are a team game, right? You're in an adventuring party and you're meant to deal with everything as a group, or at least most situations I should say. And it's because of this that if you decide to split the party for large amounts of time, you are effectively splitting the attention of the GM, thus giving the other players no playtime at all, and could potentially be putting the game on pause for them entirely, depending upon your particular action. But when it comes to splitting the party, most of the time it is inevitable, because there will be situations where a party member wants to scout ahead of the group, or perhaps do something that pertains to their backstory, and so forth. And don't get me wrong, these situations are perfectly fine and really add to the story, but if it becomes the entire focus of the session, or becomes the entire focus of the campaign, when one player is constantly going off and doing things by themselves forever during a session, then that's when it becomes an issue, because the other players begin to ask themselves, why did I even come to this game session if all I was going to be doing was watching you play the game, and I and my fellow players don't even get to play the game, because all we're doing now, and all the game is focusing on, is your actions, not our actions as a party. So if you're a GM or a player, make sure that if a player goes off and does something by themselves, that it doesn't take up tons of session time. Because by separating yourself from the party, like I mentioned before, you are splitting the GM's attention, and now the GM is having to describe and facilitate multiple rooms or scenarios at once. which can be pretty difficult at times. And definitely be sure that if you're the player, that you are not hogging tons of screen time, I should say, by yourself, and that you are bringing other people into the spotlight and sharing in the moments together as a group, which leads me to my next point, number 5, which is, don't hog the spotlight. So like I said before, most TTRPG are cooperative games. You are meant to deal with everything as a group, and it's because of this that one player should not be making all of the decisions for themselves, and one player should not be role-playing every situation by themselves. And it's because of this that if you're a new player, be sure to bring other players into the spotlight by asking them in-game questions or just trying to interact with them in-game with your characters. Most TTRPGs have some sort of an emphasis on role-playing. I mean, obviously it's literally in the name because after all, they're called role-playing games for a reason. And because of this, if you have 4 to 6 or more people in a group, it can be difficult to share the spotlight and allow other players to speak or roleplay with one another or other NPCs in the world you're exploring. But if you're an experienced player, or perhaps you're a player who is new but you really like to roleplay and you realize that you're taking up a lot of the roleplaying time and you don't really know about other characters and how they interact with the world because they never get a chance to roleplay with the NPCs or speak on the party's behalf or roleplay with other characters in the party, then you can easily bring them into the spotlight by asking them simple questions in the game via your characters. Questions like,
Hey, Throden, so what do you think about this situation? And do we go along with this quest or should we do something else?
or perhaps,
Hey, Eladriel, that was some pretty nifty spellcraft back there. You saved my life. Where'd you learn that kind of magic anyways?
by asking other players, or more so their characters, these questions in-game, it immediately puts the spotlight and the focus on them and allows them to roleplay their character. And a lot of times, especially for newer players who are getting into the game, if they don't know that this is something that they should do in terms of not hogging the spotlight, sometimes they can get completely focused and so excited on the fact that they're roleplaying their character that they don't begin to realize that other players aren't getting the chance to roleplay their character and to bask in the spotlight. But like my examples I just gave, if you ask other players these questions in-game, then it allows them to roleplay their character, and especially for newer players who perhaps are a little uncomfortable with the whole role-playing aspect, this allows them to get used to it in a natural way, as opposed to just throwing them into the situation and expecting them to immediately start role-playing. So in general, make sure that if you are going to be in the spotlight, that you are allowing other people time in it as well. Bring them into the spotlight if they're a little bit more shy, or perhaps just make sure that other players are getting a chance to roleplay their character by dialoguing with them in-game with your characters. But now we're moving on to number 4 on my unspoken rules list, be prepared. So this is a pretty self-explanatory and simple one, right? Well, I would argue that it's actually a pretty deceptively simplistic one, when in reality it's actually fairly complicated, or has at least a little bit more depth to it than most players would guess. Because while yes, this means obviously showing up with your dice, your notes, and so forth, and perhaps, of course, snacks, this also means having your character sheet ready and knowing your character's abilities and knowing how they work. While the GM normally helps explaining abilities or features if they happen to know how they work, it is not their responsibility to know each and every feature you take and to manage your character sheet for you. So if you're not prepared, it's very good to make sure that you are prepared by knowing your character and knowing what their spells and abilities do. Because if you show up to a game session, you begin to cast spells or use features and don't even know what goes into those spells or features, and you're just putting it entirely on the GM to know what they do, this can lead to a lot of page flipping on the players or the GM side of things, and can lead to a lot of time being wasted just looking up rules as opposed to playing the game. So if you're not prepared, know that it can slow down the session. So it's very important to make sure that you know what your character does in terms of their features, abilities, and spells, and know how they interact with the world around you. And the reason why I say this is because in my experience as a GM, I have seen tons of times where a player has leveled up and they've just gone through the process and picked up some spells, or they picked up some features or abilities that they thought were cool because they read the name and were like, whoa, that sounds really neat, I want that on my character sheet, and maybe they write it down, or if they're in a VTT, they just leveled up and then take the feature or ability and completely forget about it, and then completely forget to use that feature, spell, or ability when the time is right. And you may be saying, oh, well, it's the GM's responsibility to remind them about that. And I would say it's not, because it is the player's responsibility to know their features, spells, and so forth, and the GM already has a lot on their plate anyways. So if you're a new player, just make sure that if you pick up features, spells, or abilities, you are prepared in the sense that you know what they do and you know how they interact with other NPCs or enemies during combat or the world around you. And as a quick note, if you play online, like on a VTT like Foundry or Roll20, this issue becomes substantially easier to manage because most VTTs nowadays have a database where you can easily word search for a rule, spell, feature, or ability, or hover over a quick link and it will show you a description of the effect or so forth. But anyways, we are getting closer to the top of my list with number 3. Make sure you're having fun. And this is another rule that can be completely unspoken of because I feel like a lot of people assume that that is the point you're playing a game. Because obviously if you're playing a game, normally the focus is you want to have fun, right? Like if you're playing a game or a TTRPG like Dungeons & Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder and so forth, a lot of us find those games really fun and exciting. But the truth of the matter is, there are a lot of people who don't like playing those games. So if you're not enjoying the game, talk to the GM or your fellow players about it. Express the reasons you're not having fun so that they can try to make the experience more enjoyable for you by changing the way they're dealing with situations, describing scenarios on the GM side of things, or perhaps maybe their playstyle, and so forth. By doing this, you immediately can solve a problem that you may be having during your game sessions. And of course, maybe you just need to change the game system you're playing, or maybe you just need to take a break, which is all perfectly fine. But regardless, this is a rule that I feel like isn't always covered, but is a very important one. I myself have had situations where a player just tagged along to every game session because they wanted to play with their friends and they wanted to be included in the many jokes that arose from their D&D sessions, but they weren't having any fun because TTRPGs just weren't for them. And it wasn't until I, being the GM, stepped in and asked that player, hey, are you actually here for having fun? Like, do you want to play the game? Because it seems like you're not enjoying yourself. For them to actually admit that they weren't having fun and for them to talk with the other players and just say, this isn't for me, I think I'm gonna leave. But that's why I want to bring this up, because it is important to make sure that you are having fun in the game. And if you aren't, maybe you just need to switch up your game system, or perhaps try a different group if that group isn't for you, or perhaps maybe try a different role in that game in terms of your class or your position in the group and so forth. Because again, if you aren't having fun, make sure that you are expressing that to the other players so that we can try to change things around so that you are having more fun. And most of the time, us GMs really want to make sure that you as the player are having fun, so come to us first and just express your opinions, or more so perhaps your issues with the campaign, and see if they can fix it for you. And speaking of game masters, we are now moving on to number 2 on my list. Respect the game master. So if you're a new player, this is a very important thing to know. Do not piss off the game master. Again, generally this rule is a given, which is the reason why it goes completely unspoken of in most TTRPG sessions and at most tables. But it's been super surprising to me, being a professional GM, how many times I've had to reiterate this to not only new players, but also experienced players. The GM is the one who is running the game, so it's very important to respect them. Otherwise, the entire game comes crashing down, because after all, they are the person who is literally creating the world around where the players are exploring. And respecting the GM means following their rulings, even if you don't agree with them. And if you happen to not agree with them, generally most GMs are more than happy to explain their reasoning either immediately after you ask them or after the game session. And keep in mind, respecting the GM includes things such as no metagaming, no trying to undermine their authority and take over the game session, and also make sure that they're ruling and realize that their ruling is final. Because while the rules in the core rulebooks are meant to be a guideline, the GM has the final say in the matter. And trust me, I know that if you're also a game master, or perhaps if you're a person who really knows the rules, it can be difficult to just allow the GM to change the rules however they would like. But most of the time, there is a reason why they are doing so. So again, like I had mentioned before in the video, if you're ever confused with a ruling or you want an explanation, just ask for it, and most of the time the GM will be happy to give that to you, either during the session or after the game session. It's important to realize that the game master is there to make the game fun for everyone, so be respectful of their time and effort and don't cause issues during the game session that could take away from the experience of your fellow players and the experience that the game master has spent potentially dozens of hours trying to create for you. And this kind of goes into what I was saying previously in the video, where if you're being a rules lawyer, or a disruptive player, or a murder hobo, you are not respecting the game master's time and effort that they put into the session and the experience that they are trying to give you, because you are spending hordes of time during the session going over rules, or getting obsessed with how the rules are implemented, or being disruptive and chaotic, or perhaps just being a murder hobo and completely disregarding all of the plot hooks and so forth the GM is throwing at you because you want to kill, murder, and slay everything in sight. And one other thing I want to interject here, because it is pretty important to know these things, especially if you're a new player, in terms of the etiquette in regards to interacting with the GM. So I'll quickly rapid fire them here for you. So, number 1, don't interrupt the GM when they're describing a scene, a final blow, or an effect unless the situation calls for it. Because while it is important that you have to interject in the GM's description to fix a crucial moment where your player or perhaps another player's character could be dying and you want to save them with a particular feature, that is perfectly acceptable. But if you cut off a description of a scene by saying, I need to go to the bathroom, or I'll be right back, or wait, can you describe that again? It can ruin the flow that the GM is trying to build and can potentially ruin the image that the other players are trying to craft in their mind. But moving on to number 2, especially do not interrupt the GM's evil monologue. This is just kind of rude, and the GM has spent a lot of time normally building up to the evil bad guy's monologue, so give them their chance to live out their evil bad guy fantasy. Number 3 though, let the GM have a chance to answer a question before you do, because after all, the GM's ruling is final. And number 4, respect the GM's time and effort when it comes to running the campaign. So in summary, make sure that you're just being generally respectful to your game master, because again, as I'd mentioned previously, the game cannot happen without the game master. So make sure you're not pissing them off and being respectful of their time and effort. But now we are moving on to number 1 on my list of rules that go completely unspoken: be a team player. So as I had mentioned before, TTRPGs are generally a team game, and with certain game systems like Pathfinder for example, teamwork is crucial to succeeding at combat encounters, so it's very important to be a team player. This means working together with your fellow players to achieve common goals, whether those goals be trying to locate the informants for a crime syndicate, or perhaps hunting down the 4 generals of the Demon Lord's army, etc., and you get the point. But this also means being supportive and interested in your fellow party members' characters. In my experience as a game master, I have seen tons of issues arise at the table because one player or multiple players, and by extension their characters, were playing the game for themselves rather than being a team player and playing as a group. Whether it be interacting with NPCs, or during combat, or dividing the loot at the end of a dungeon, every single action they took was for themselves and they didn't care at all about the other characters, and by extension, the players. And because of this, I've seen scenarios where the party has outright refused to heal or help a character because that character, and by extension the player, didn't care about the other party members to begin with. So why should the party care about them? As I'm sure you can imagine, this led to some problems at the table, which inevitably led to a discussion with the self-centered player if they were the right fit for the group. So keep in mind, if you're not a team player, you're going to make the game less enjoyable for everyone because everyone at the table won't think of you as a part of the team, but instead competition or perhaps a liability, which can lead to some major conflicts down the road. And a classic example of this type of player is the untrustworthy rogue who constantly tries to steal other items from the other players, or constantly tries to get to the treasure chest first at the end of the dungeon to take as much valuables from it as possible and then hide them from the other players, or their characters. But keep in mind, most TTRPGs are a team game, so if you are hoarding all the gold for yourself, or if you are actively trying to steal items from other players, while it can be all fun and games initially, it can build up some resentment towards you as a player and your character in-game. So be sure to try to avoid that, or clarify with the other players that it's all in the sake of fun, and ask them if they're okay with it or not, maybe after the session or before a session, so that way you make sure you're not stepping on anyone's toes. But those were my top 10 unspoken rules that every TTRPG player should know when playing a TTRPG, and I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, feel free to leave a like and comment down below if I happen to miss a particular unspoken rule that you want to share with me, or perhaps other people who come to this video. And also let me know what you guys think in the comments as well. But as always everybody, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take it easy. Bye-bye.